Good evening. Can everybody hear me without a mic? Hello? Is that better? Does that help?
Oh my goodness.
There you go, got your attention. First of all, thanks for showing up tonight. I know we have some other community events that you could have opted to attend, and I just want to thank you for attending this presentation tonight. And I'm certain you're going to leave here more informed about this topic than when you came. It's our pleasure tonight to have Tony Mangini from the Michigan Municipal League. He's their Associate Executive Director and plus their Chief Operating Officer. And Tony has been going around the state talking about this topic of Michigan's broken municipal finance system. And he's got some great information that he's going to share with you. He's willing to answer questions, and he says you don't have to wait to the end. If you have something on your mind while he's talking, get his attention. He'll take care of that question right away. I'll be around if you have a question. I can bring the mic to you if you're worried about everybody hearing. So I'll try to keep my eyes open on who's got questions. Just get your arm up and we'll get a mic to you. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy.
Thank you, sir. Well, without question, this is the nicest place I've ever done this. Pretty spectacular. I was telling Thad, been with the league for a little over 10 years, and the very first meeting I ever came to was in this building. The mayors met here a little over 10 years ago. So the first place I ever came, and it's truly spectacular. Although they made us stay on the other side of the wall, but great spot. So, oops, hold on a second. Jumping ahead. We tested this, didn't we?
Yeah.
All right. Well, when we talk about, there we go, now we're backwards. Okay. If you want to see what I looked like 10 years ago when I was at this meeting, that's the pictures from then. So, but I do appreciate the opportunity to do this. So, all right, now we're going. Okay. So, part of the reason we're doing this is, we talk about great places, and we think that that is really at the core of what drives our economy. And everybody knows what great places look like. But the problem becomes, we don't have enough places that look like this. Because our economy doesn't work, our system doesn't work, the way we fund local government doesn't work. So we have too many places that look like this. And that's really a function of our system. You guys have a wonderful community here. You're weathering this far better than most. And Thad was showing off earlier, driving around and showing some of these things. But what drives this? What makes these types of places happen? Contrary to popular belief, I would suggest it's not mismanagement, it's not corruption, all the popular things that make for great news stories. It's really about what's happening to our cities and the local economy. And part of the question I think you need to ask yourself is, why do you care? Why does it matter how Michigan's funding model works in your community? Because if we can't attract and retain talent in this state, we're done. It's over. And all you need to do to understand that is look around the country. We are losing ground on a relative basis in Michigan. The only evidence you need to understand that is our congressional delegation, right? That same number of Congress people exist from year to year. That doesn't change no matter how many people live in this country. They just move them around. And ours is shrinking. Because on a relative basis, we're not growing at the same rate as the rest of the country. And that's having a dramatic impact on that, because we're not doing the things we need to do to keep people here. And there's some pocket examples where we're having better success than other places, but we need to start thinking differently. And so when we don't properly fund our communities, and we can't have wonderful amenities like we have right here, people start to feel differently about it, and they don't want to be a part of Michigan. They start to move on and move out. And we've got to do something to combat that. So what are the issues? Oh, I got 3 for 1 there. The biggest one problem right now is Michigan's funding model for local government doesn't track with the economy. We just came out of a big recession, and Michigan's model is built in such a way that it tracks downward very well. It tracks downward very well, but it doesn't track upward. And that's something that people don't understand. I think right now with folks, is there a general sentiment that the economy is improving? And I think most people would say yes, there is. And so there's probably, you would assume that your local government is also having a revenue increase, that they're also benefiting from a prosperous economy. And that's not the case. And that's because of the way our tax system's built. We have the second most restrictive tax system in the country, according to Michigan State University. Values decline without limit, but then no matter how far they fall, they will only go up at inflation of 5%. So I'll show you some data about that in a little bit that will really drive that place home. Michigan, the state now, I'm talking about the state's budget, their priorities have disinvested in local government. They've diverted money away from the services they use, police, fire, parks, those types of things, and invested those in the state bureaucracy or in tax cuts for other things. Many of the problems that locals face can be fixed locally. It's easy to say the city needs to do this or the city needs to do that, but many of these problems that they're being asked to address, they don't have the legal authority to do so. And so we need to think differently about how we can deal with some of those things. There's just not enough tools in the toolbox. One of the things that I get to do on behalf of cities in Michigan as a member of the Michigan Municipal League is go around and talk to colleagues around the country and try to understand what are they doing, what are some of the things they're doing. There's neat ideas out there, and we don't have some of those tools here. We don't have local options. There's a lot of things that we don't have in Michigan that they have in other places, and places that are kicking our butts. So we need to think about some of those type things. Oops. And we need a three-tiered approach. This isn't just about more money. More money's great, and we think we could be investing the money we have more wisely, but we also need to look at the cost side of the equations, and we need to think about the structure of how we deliver services. So that's what we talk about when we talk about a three-tiered approach. We want to look at the revenues for sure, but we also want to look at costs. We want to look at structure. So to that end, I want to give you kind of a foundation to understand, why is this so critical, why is it important, and give you some basic understanding. This slide right here really drives that point home harder than any other slide I think that you're going to see today. Michigan, in case you can't read it, we're the only one in the country. We are 50th in the nation in terms of the funding that we are providing, or I should say the change in funding that we're providing over that 10-year period. This is U.S. Census Bureau data. It'll be updated. They do it every 5 years, so it'll be updated shortly. 50th in the nation. The average is a 50% increase, and we're an 8.5% decline. How can you compete with neighboring states to attract and retain talent if they're experiencing, on average, a 50% increase and we're having an 8% decline? Our next closest one is Ohio, and they're just under 30%. You can't. The answer is you can't. This is a similar graph. This is the dollars that flow from the state of Michigan, from their budget, down to local government. There's a thing called revenue sharing. You're going to hear that phrase a few times today. Revenue sharing, contrary to what some might think, is not a benevolent gift from the state. It was something that's been in place for decades, which was a way of sharing revenues that are collected, sales tax, income tax, a variety of things, that used to flow down to local government. When Proposal A passed, and a lot of people think of that as a school aid reform measure, one of the things that did is it said, we're going to give cities a share of the sales tax and sales tax only. The state has reneged on that deal essentially, and you're going to see some data in a minute about that, and we are now 50% decline, 56% decline over that period of time. Pretty dramatic stuff. Taxes. I talked a minute ago about our tax situation in Michigan. No one wants to pay taxes, me included. Okay, I understand that. Taxes is a dirty word. Having said that, it is the primary source for funding for local government. The two biggest revenue sources for local government are property taxes and revenue sharing from the state. And if you don't have an income tax, they typically represent from 2/3 to 3/4 of your local budget. The state has been squeezing on revenue sharing pretty hard. Property tax I talked about, we have this interaction with Headley, which passed in the 70s, proposed lay, which passed in the 90s. That basically what happens is, so you can see this is a graph that shows, it's a different 10-year period, but it's 2004 to 2014. And this, of course, would be representative of that Great Recession. And in some places, these drops were much, much greater. This is a statewide look at this. So what happens in our system now is when those values drop, no matter how far they drop, they're frozen at those new levels, okay? And even though the economy had gotten to here, and cities' costs would continue on that inflationary line, when this drops, it doesn't care about this anymore. And now it's reset at this level. So we are now in 2014 at levels we were at in 2005. Again, that's an average thing. Some cities were hit far, far worse. In Southeast Michigan, I know of communities that lost 50% of their taxable value. 50%. But they saw no decline in service demands. They saw no decline in the services that residents expected. It becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to deal with. And Michigan communities have little to no ability to generate revenue. We'll talk more about that. But basically what we have in Michigan is the ability to cut and cut only. And when you cut dollars, you cut services. So, revenue sharing. We talked about that a minute ago. A couple years ago, I wrote an article. We have a magazine we put out 6 times a year at the league. And we've been talking for years about how much revenue sharing we lost. And at the time when I wrote it, it was about $6 billion. We're now up to $7.5 billion. And I'll be honest, nobody paid a lot of attention to that. And so the article that I wrote, I went through and I said, I wonder what certain communities lost. And we started looking at it on a community by community basis. And you can see up at the top of this graph, we'll give you an idea. So the city of Manistee has lost almost $2.7 million. And what's interesting about that now, everyone in this room is already thinking about this. $2.7 million here, wow, we could have done X. Right away, people have a vision of what that means. Nobody knows what $6.5 billion meant or $7.5 billion now means on a statewide basis. But when you start thinking about what that means to your community, and maybe some of the tough decisions that you made or opportunities that were lost because you didn't have the funding that the revenue sharing formulas would have called for the city to receive, you start to realize what a big issue that is. And make no mistake about it, that is a question of budget priorities, okay? Sales tax dollars were relatively flat throughout the entire recession, and they've trended upward. They've been a very stable source of revenue, which for folks that have worked in cities for a long time know that was actually part of the sales pitch when we moved from a system where we used to get a little piece of income tax, there was sales tax, inventory reimbursement, intangibles tax. There were all these little buckets of money, and we'd get checks every month, and sometimes they were big because it was sales, and the next time it was small because it was something else. And so we're going to get away from that. There's too much volatility. Sales tax is a much more stable source of revenue, so we're going to give you a bigger piece of that and take all the rest of those away. And they were right. It was more stable. But what they didn't tell us was that the minute they started to have problems, what they would do is they would take those stable dollars from us and use it to balance the state budget. So essentially, they've chosen state bureaucracies over local services. It's that simple. It's a budget priority choice. What matters most? And so one of the things that the state would like to say is, well, things were tough all over, right? We all suffered during this period of time. But the data, again, would tell you something different. So again, that from 2002 to 2012, state revenues were up roughly 29%. But again, the money that they sent back to local government, down 56%. So this idea of shared sacrifice is not quite as level a playing field as they might like you to think. And we honestly, we know from talking to people that they put greater value on the service they receive locally. That's what people think about, the services they care about. So where'd that money go? Where did they send money rather than send it here? So again, we're the, right on the end here. And revenue sharing has two components. One is constitutional, which they can't touch. The other is statutory, so you can see that's obviously the bigger one. But you can see some of the different areas that saw big increases. The Attorney General's office, 50%, DEQ, 70%, legislature, they took care of themselves good. I mean, so you can see that these are the choices that they made in doing that. Just interesting little tidbit. We've lost more police officers locally than exist in the entire state police department. That's how many cops have been laid off across the state. It's impacting local services in a real way. This is the change in local employment. So just sort of the roles of number of employees. And again, make no mistake about it, people need services. You need people to deliver services. Local government is a labor-intensive thing that we do. And as you can see, we've had pretty dramatic decreases, and this includes schools, by the way, just to be clear, in Michigan. We're not the only ones down, but boy, again, we're number one, not in a good way. So these are things that have to change. Yes, sir?
Tony, is that in manufacturing and all jobs?
No, this is just local government employment. So this is cities, townships, counties, and schools.
Thank you.
Wages per capita. Again, another dramatic illustration of what's happening, what we're doing to the services that we're trying to provide. We're trying to compete and attract good employees. Nobody, whatever your business is, whether you're operating a business yourself, you're a manufacturer, your services, or your local government, you want to attract good employees. To do so, you got to pay good wages and all that. Well, you can see what's happening to us. In 1992, we were in the top quartile there, right? We were 13th in the nation in terms of the wages we were paying state and local employees per capita. We're now in the bottom quarter. We're now in the bottom quarter. And you have to ask yourself, what does that do to our ability to attract and retain the employees that we want to have? We've got some great folks locally, but over time that starts to have an impact. It starts to have an impact. As people are deciding where they're going to go and enter the workforce, this becomes relevant, and it's something we need to think about. And these decisions are being made. I know a lot of places that haven't given raises in years locally. Years. That's not something we can sustain on a long-term basis. We just can't do that. Our funding has got to support our service levels in a reasonable way. So this payroll comparison, again, going back to that 2002-2012 time period, state payroll, this is almost a one-for-one with their revenue growth, up 24.3%. When you look at all local payroll, cities, villages, townships, and county, we're down a little over 14%. And when you look at just cities and villages, they've been the hardest hit by far, down almost a third. Down almost a third. Those are real service impacts. So some of the things that I think we think are important to understand is what do different groups think about this. So Close-Up is a survey. It's done through the University of Michigan. They do it every year. And they survey local government officials. And they were asking some of these questions. They ask them every year. And we're seeing these trends worsening, not getting better. Again, in a stronger economy, you'd think you'd see improvement in some of these things, but we're not. So 64% agree with what I'm standing here talking about today, which is they think the system is broken. The system of funding municipal government is flat out broken. There we go, see, tricky. 82% feel the state should be compelled to address unfunded mandates. So that's something that if you're in local government, you know a lot about, and if you're not, you're saying, what are you talking about? When the Headley Amendment passed the Constitution back in the 70s, one of the things that it did is it said, we're going to limit how much revenue growth you're going to have, but to make sure that the cities aren't negatively impacted, one of the protections we're going to put in is if the state mandates that a city do something, The state has to pay for that. And you can count on less than one hand how many times the state has funded one of their mandates, because it's never happened. It's never happened. They take the position that the only things that you're required to do is hold elections and collect taxes, and everything else is an optional endeavor, so they pay for nothing. So that's a nice little sidestep. Another interesting point about that, by the way, I'll talk about just for a second since I talked about Headley. Things have gotten so bad, even though that was passed in the 70s and Prop 8 was passed in the 90s, there's a group of communities that have come together that have actually filed a lawsuit challenging a provision that was included in Headley that required that the proportion of funding that when Headley passed, which was just under 50%, I think it was 48.5%, of the state revenues used to go to local government. And local government meant schools, it meant cities, it meant villages, townships, counties. That proportion must be maintained, and that it could never go below that. Well, when Proposal A passed, Proposal A is when we went from 4-cent sales tax to 6-cent sales tax. What should have happened, but didn't, is that fraction should have been reworked to reflect the fact that they just created a new funding source that was going to throw through the state. But that didn't happen. And so the state got a gift. And put that so out of balance that we were well above it and never needed to worry about it, even though those dollars were a change in that numerator-denominator relationship. That's been existing for many years, and they've now come back and said, you know what, this is so out of whack, they've actually filed a lawsuit about that. They filed a second second point of that lawsuit, which is another interesting one. Charter schools. I don't know if you have a lot of charter schools in this area, but in Southeast Michigan, charter schools are a big deal. Lots of them. Privately operated. And the state has been counting the dollars that go to charter schools as part of this local funding contribution. And they're also challenging that. Their arguments are very interesting, compelling even. Whether that ever happens, I don't know. It'll probably take years to play out. But I think it does speak to how negatively impacted communities are that they find themselves engaged in a lawsuit with the state. Very interesting. 76% of local officials support Headley reform. Now, Headley reform, what we talk about, there are limitations that exist in there, and this is kind of technical, but I'll try to make it as untechnical as I can. When Headley first passed, it would move up and down. So in a growth period where we had more than inflation, Headley would say your millage rates go down so that you, in aggregate, wouldn't pay more than inflation and increases. And in a downward economy, it would go back up, never above your charter maximum, but it would swing both ways. The second thing that happened, so when Proposal A passed, that stopped happening. The second thing that happened when Proposal A passed, that Proposal A was when they made it about each individual homeowner, right? So everyone knows, if you've been in your house for a while, you see a taxable value and you see your SEV, right? So your taxable value is what you pay tax on, and your SEV is what the house is theoretically worth, okay? So pre-recession, the vast majority of people's SEVs would have been significantly higher than their taxable values. Well, what happens is in a recession where those drop, if they get to the taxable value and take it downward, taxable value gets reset at this lower level. Even if the next day your value went back up here again, the city's paying tax down here. So that's the problem with that other thing. But the other impact of that was, they said when they first sold it, hey, when you sell the house and it pops up, that's that pop-up they talk about, the person that buys your house pays that higher tax. That was when the city was supposed to get those taxes for that greater value. So you protected the current homeowner, but eventually the city would get the benefit. The little trick they pulled on the backside was, they said those pop-up values will go in to calculate how much Headley gets adjusted. So the impact is, even though that individual pays that higher tax, The city doesn't get the benefit because they're forced to roll the millage rate back to reflect that growth. And so the person paying the tax on the new house doesn't feel like they got anything. Everybody in this room gets a 28-cent tax break, so they don't know they got anything. But the city, let's just say 500 homes sold, or 100 homes, or whatever the right numbers for a community like Manistee, that would have been something that would have translated into services. But we lost that opportunity because of how they wrote that. So when they talk about Headley reform, they're saying those are some little tweaks that no one would even notice. Right? It would really go back to what the intent of those laws were in the first place. So there's things we can do about some of that stuff. And then 68% would support more broad local revenue options because we don't have in this state the ability to do that. There's a lot of communities that have expressed interest in doing things locally. There may be locally a desire to do something, but we don't have those tools here in Michigan. And so there's a lot of support for that. That's local officials. So what does the public think? So we participated and funded a piece of an EPIC MRA poll. And the results were very interesting. 48% across the state felt that local government is underfunded. %52% said they would support higher taxes, not to improve services, but just to maintain what they had. Dad and I had a chance to grab a bite to eat before the meeting here, and we track our election cycles. We'll look to see local millage budgets, how they do, and they generally pass at an 85% or above rate across the state. People understand what they get locally, and if they understand and they see value, they're willing to pay for it. Sometimes it's surprising. 65% disapprove of the state's diversion of revenue sharing. What I find most interesting about that, not that 65% disapprove, but that 65% even knew what revenue sharing was. So that actually makes us feel a little bit better. But again, I think it speaks to the idea of where do people see value. If you're going to pay taxes, and we're going to pay, where do you want to see those dollars go? Do you want to see them going up to the biggest level of bureaucracy in government here in the state, or do you want to see them locally where you can feel their impact? And I think most folks are saying they would like to see them here. And then 48% feel that in a strong economy, you would expect to see property taxes going up. And that goes back to what we were talking about before. Our system does not track with the economy. It just doesn't. Our communities are hopelessly hamstrung by the system that we have right now. And we need a system that's going to allow us to track with that economy. So what do? The league has been talking for several months now about sort of this three-tiered strategy. We think I've spent a lot of time talking about revenues and things like that, but we also need to talk about cost, and we need to talk about structure. We can be better at what we do, no question about it. And we be smarter about what we do. But for a lot of these things, we're going to need help. And so we're really working hard right now with the legislature to work on some of this stuff. So I just talked a little bit ago, I'll expand on just a little bit more. We've got to fix our property tax system. It is the single biggest source of revenue. There's only 22 communities in the state that have an income tax. So for most places, the vast majority of places, property taxes are their primary source of revenue. Typically, it's about half of their revenue sources. And it's a revenue source right now that does not track with the economy. It just doesn't. And over a long haul, it's going to be to our detriment right now. Addressing unfunded obligations, in particular OPEB. OPEB is other post-employment benefits. It really means retiree health care. In Michigan, we had an interesting thing happen here because we were, labor movement was huge here, industrial economy. The auto industry, to a large degree, set the labor market in Michigan. And we were all forced to compete with them. And they offered very rich benefits, and so we offered rich benefits. Many years ago, not that many years ago actually, they've all gotten away from doing that. Cities don't have the same ability to just unilaterally make those changes. And the result is we have right now, we surveyed our 300 largest members in the state, and the liability for those 300 alone was $6.5 billion. MSU took a little broader look at it, not as detailed, but it was a little broader in scope, and their number was closer to $8 billion of liabilities as today to pay for those benefits in the future. When you look at the amount that some communities are paying out of their current operating budget to fund those costs, it's just unsustainable. And so one of the things that we've been talking about is we need to think differently about this. We want to make sure that people have a good, livable health benefit in retirement. But cities exist not to pay retiree benefits. Retiree benefits are something that we do because we provide services. And right now the equation's getting kind of upside down. And so we got to think differently about that. But that's going to require the state to help. Right now, that's something that is bargained city by city, union by union, and even if you fix that problem, it's fixed for a contract or it's fixed for a union. And so one of the things we're encouraging the state to do is let's take a broader look at that. Maybe that's something that we do collectively. Maybe that we think how we deliver that benefit in a smarter way. That could create real dollars that are available for services. So that's something we think is important and a huge, huge number. We've got to get away from a cut-only strategy in Michigan. So what I mean by that is this. In Michigan, you can only do what you find statutory authority to do. In some states, it's the opposite. You can do anything unless there's a prohibition on doing it. In Michigan, it's the opposite. It's called Dillon's Rule. So you got to find statutory authority to do that. So there's virtually no revenue-raising capacity, practically speaking, for local governments in Michigan. Which means if I have a budget problem, when Dad's got a budget problem, the only way to fix it is to cut. You cut services. Sometimes those cuts aren't that big and no one notices. Maybe he skips a cutting of the parks, or we cancel a festival, or we turn off every other light bulb in here. There are things that you can do that people know, but at some point those cuts become real. And what I want to suggest to you is this. What is the economic engine? When I say the economic engine, what is the revenue driver for cities? Their biggest revenue source is property tax. That's a function of two things: millage rate and value. What drives value? It's the kind of place you live in, right? It's the kind of place. What makes a house worth $50,000 in one community and $5 million in the other when they're not much different? It's the place. And part of that is the types of things that your community does to create value. You know, this facility, I drove me all around town, you have some amazing amenities here in town. Imagine if they were gone tomorrow. Imagine if you pulled up to the beach and there was a rope across because they can't afford to maintain that anymore, so the beach is closed. Is that gonna have a negative impact in this community? Is that gonna drive down values? I think the answer is pretty obvious that it would. And that's what we're talking about. We need to start thinking about what can we do to create investment opportunities to drive the value up. If you fixed a business's budget problems by closing their factories, I fixed it for the day, but I've taken away their ability to create new revenue. That's their revenue driver, right? Making their widgets or doing whatever they do. And for a city, it's creating value. Having this community have increased value. So we got to think differently. How can we invest? A little interesting statistic. Over 85% of the GDP across the country comes out of cities. So that's why I keep using the word invest. There's a value, there's a real value in creating these places where people want to be. We got to get away else from building and abandoning infrastructure. Michigan has been roughly 10 million people, give or take, for the last 20, 30 years. Think about how much infrastructure we've added during that same period of time, with the same 10 million people trying to sustain it. I use Flint as an example a lot because if you were anywhere in the United States in the last year, you had to have heard about Flint, right? At its core, Flint is a great illustration of two things. One, our cut-only strategy. You know, they talk about why did Flint make this decision? And the answer was, I don't care what anyone else tells you, the answer is this. The emergency manager had one job and one job only, that's to balance the budget. And secondly, the only tools he had available was to cut. And The Detroit Water and Sewer System has something like 100 different customers in their regional system. It's a massive system, serves huge swath of Southeast Michigan. And they stood up and they said, well, there was an opportunity to save money. That's why we did that. You know how many other communities faced with the same rate challenges and increased costs and everything else made that decision to leave? None. Because they weren't forced to think about only what can I do, what can I cut, what can I cut, what can I cut. So that cut-only mentality didn't allow for a conversation about water quality, long-term service needs, any of that stuff. Those conversations didn't take place because it was very singularly focused. Second thing, though, that I think it drives home the point of, that system was built to support 200,000 people. There's under 100,000 people in Flint now. They also happen to be the 100,000, probably with the least means to pay those costs. So you sort of knew the outcome just based on those facts alone. What if we thought about infrastructure differently? What if we said, before we build new, we leverage what we have? Think about it more as almost as a statewide asset, not state-controlled asset, but a statewide asset. There are examples around this state where there was existing infrastructure that could serve an area that's across an imaginary line, and rather than do that, we incent the building of new infrastructure, even though the capacity existed. We think that's a misuse of dollars. Those are dollars that could be used for other things that would benefit all of us. So we think that that's an opportunity to look at as well. There we go. And again, so true growth. This gets back to what I talked about when I talked about our relative size across the rest of the country. We're not experiencing true growth. And you'll hear people say we've added 200,000 jobs or 300,000 jobs, and that may very well be true. But we're still losing ground on a relative basis. And the reason we're losing ground on a relative basis is we got to create those places again. We've been the league's been talking about this for a long time. Example I love to use right now, I was just, if you can believe this, I was in Phoenix in August, which is about 3 degrees hotter than the surface of the sun. But in spite of that, people are going there in droves. I have 4 cousins that have moved down there just in the last 5 years. And they tell you when you go outside, don't touch your car handle because you'll burn your hand. And you want to go start your car for 20 minutes to cool it off before you get in it. And they're going there in droves. Oh, and there's no water, by the way. And if you turn around, the scenery looks the same in every direction because it's just, right? And people are going there in droves. And why are they going there in droves? Because they're creating places, the services, all the stuff we're talking about. They've got it. That they're doing. And so people are fighting through all the rest of those challenges. We've got to be better at that. We need to grow on a relative basis. We need to grow on a relative basis. Imagine if another 1 million people lived in the state of Michigan right now. What that would mean economically for businesses, for property values, for revenues available for services. It would be dramatic. It would be dramatic. We've got to do the things that incent true growth. We have created a very favorable tax climate, especially business-wise right now in the state. It's not creating true growth. It just isn't. Yes, we've added some jobs, but it's not creating that true growth. So we need to re-examine that. What should we do? What can we invest in? And again, we think investing locally will have that positive impact to try to get folks here. And again, well, I guess I said the first one last, or the last one first. Investing in communities is highly important because they are the economic drivers. No business can succeed unless there's residents there to buy their goods and services, to work in their manufacturing plants or whatever services it is. We've got to invest in those communities to make them the places we want them to be. So what have we been doing as a league? And by the way, I'll just say this, I assume everyone knows, but the league represents cities and villages all across the state. We've got a few township members as well. And so that's why we're here, and that's why we're working on this stuff. And so what have we been doing? We've been meeting a lot with the governor and his staff and with legislators. We've been doing this for many months now, working hard to get them to understand. One of the things that we struggle with and have struggled with for many years now is when we eliminated term limits, it created an information void because their tenure is short, and some of these problems are very long in the making. And so revenue sharing is a great one. I do interviews very regularly with newspapers or radio stations, whatever it is, and they want to talk about revenue sharing. And I'll talk to them about, you know, since 2002, we've lost $7 billion, blah, 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 blah. And I had an interesting thing happen, and it happened 2 interviews in a row. And the reporter called me back, and he's like, I'm not calling you a liar, but, you know, I talked to legislator so-and-so, and he's adamant that they raised revenue sharing like 3 years in a row. I said, you know what? He's right. I said, the problem is that's how long his history is. Mine, unfortunately, is much longer. And I understand what it is. So, yes, we came to here and we went up 3% from, you know, this bottom pit we were in. So technically he's right, but if you, it's okay, I get it, you know, and so they provide the context. They don't have that context. So we've been meeting with them a lot and trying to get them to understand those facts. And by the way, I want to point out, those have been very positive meetings. We are having a lot of conceptual support for what we've been talking about and advocating. Speaking to outside groups, that's why I'm here. We think it's very important to get outside of our typical sound box. Thad and I can talk all day about this. It doesn't move the needle one bit. We understand it, we get it, we know the importance of it. We need folks to understand, why does this matter to you? Think about it in that context. Why do you care? Why do you care as a business owner? Why do you care as a resident? Because you should. You should. I mean, you should either care that I'm full of crap, or you should care that you know what, I do think that my local government needs to be healthy and provide the services that I want to enjoy and have in my community. We've been working hard on policy development. We are talking to our colleagues across the country, looking for ideas that we can beg, borrow, and steal, you know, rethinking some of this stuff and involving people in trying to think, what are some of the things that we can do here in Michigan? That includes drafting legislation. We hope in the near future to start introducing some of these ideas legislatively. We've worked with a couple of bigger law firms downstate to try and craft some of these ideas that we've talked about. For example, the Headley fixes, some of the other things. We've got some draft legislation that would work for some of that stuff. This is going to be a long game. This is not something that's going to be fixed in the next couple weeks here. We're starting to put some of these ideas together so that they can start to have some of this debate and conversation in Lansing. The education outreach, that includes all of you, that includes other community groups, chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs. I've talked to just about every organization you could think of trying to spread this message. We've done a tremendous amount of press outreach. We've had a lot of op-eds written. We just think it's that important, and people need to understand the issue and what it means to do that. To that end, we have commissioned a couple of independent reports by outside agencies. The first one on the left, if you are a data numbers geek, you will love. If you're not, you may want to kill yourself if you read it. But it is filled with just a ton of information that really lays out how we got here. It goes back over the last 20 years, and it starts to lay the foundation for all the stuff I've blown through quickly. If you want to understand that in a deeper dive, I would encourage you to take a look at that report. The second report is a much easier read, but it starts to go back to this idea of place as a way of moving our economy forward. Because we really do believe that talent, attraction, and retention is key to that. And so this report, we've talked a lot about the value of that and why we think it's important and what it means economically. And we said, you know what, is this just something that we say because it feels good, or is there any data out there to support this? So we hired public sector consultants to compile this report. And what they've come back and told us is, you know what, it's real. The economic data supports it. You see increases in value doing these types of strategies, and the types of people you can attract and retain, the educational attainment, income attainment, all the things that you want to do as part of economic development, and it lays that out for you. This report, by the way, I didn't say that, but this was done by Mitch Bean, who was the House Fiscal Agency Director for many years, and Bob Klein, who's former state treasurer, put the other report together. Both of those reports are available at a website we've created called SaveMyCity.org. I would encourage you to go there. We're trying to put as much information as we can out there so that you can tell the story yourself. So those reports I just talked to, you can go out there and either download them or look at them online if you like. There are other reports as well that are out there that will allow you to do that. We have also created a revenue sharing loss calculator, and that goes back, we have Manistee Township out there, but you can look up any city, village, or township in the state through this revenue sharing loss calculator and see how much they lost. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it for counties. Their formula is a little quirky. We couldn't really do that one, but that data is out there. So if you're curious, go out there and take a look at that. Other reports, there's a blog out there that myself and some other folks will occasionally write up things that are going on. So that's if you got time to go look at that, I encourage you to do that. And occasionally we'll throw a survey out there. So I think that is my last slide, if I'm not mistaken. So I'd be thrilled to answer questions and start with you.
I just have a comment I want to make. I'm the chief deputy treasurer of the county.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first started, where I live in Beulah, Michigan, it's a hugely tourist area. And you have a lot of homes on either Crystal Lake or Flat Lake, whatever the case may be. And you see a lot of aging families that are starting to hand their homes down. They're not their primary residence, but they're starting to hand their homes down to their children. And prior to December 31st of 2014, when that happened, the property tax value uncapped. And you had some aggressive assessors that might say, okay, I'm going all the way back to whenever this thing happened, and now you're going to pay for that TRE. And I have billed people $35,000, $50,000. I mean, these young families cannot afford that. These are homes that have been in their generations forever. And so then finally in 2014, we saw it change, where now when it goes from blood to blood, from father to daughter, whatever the case may be, it can no longer uncap. And the state knew that was coming, so what they did was they audited us like really heavy. And I probably billed 109 people that year. And what happened was the state gets 70% of the interest. So if you take somebody's uncapping all the way back to 2002, they're coming up with a huge bill, and the state gets 70%, the county gets 10%, the township gets 20%. And I haven't seen the state do that since that happened from blood to blood. So that's been a good thing for our community. But we have, like I said, assessors that go all the way back and bill these kids. And I've had people come into my office in tears, like, oh, I can't afford to keep the cottage. And that was a really unfortunate thing. And that was part of the whole, I mean, that's the only good thing I've seen happen since I've been doing this job, is that they stopped that from happening. But it was just really creating havoc amongst the people that didn't live here full time. And we go from 17,000 census a year to 50,000 in the summertime. So that's huge for us.
Sure.
Huge for our local revenue.
Anybody else? In the back?
What year did they remove the statutory funding from local governments?
They never removed it, but they started diminishing it in, we're down in 2000, then went back up to normal. So 2002, since 2002, it's never been fully funded.
Okay, but we've seen it be completely cut out.
Well, for some communities, so all right, let me answer your question differently. In aggregate, it's been declining since 2002. Depending on how much you were getting, there are a lot of communities that don't have any left. Because the statutory is done as part of a complicated formula that tries to recognize the revenue raising capacity of two different communities. For example, if you have very high property values per capita, you can obviously, $1 mil for you means a lot, and $1 mil to someone who has low values means a little. So revenue sharing was part of a stabilizer for that. The size of government, and that was meant to recognize, for example, like a county seat type place where you maybe have more service demands than others. So the formula is pretty complicated to do that. So if you were a smaller community that didn't get a lot and didn't have a lot of those other things, you may have quickly we had none. But that's all over the board right now. But in aggregate, We've gone from about 900 million to about 250 a year right now. We're underfunded every year by 650 or something like that. Yeah.
What percentage of Michigan's population live in actual cities? And one of the reasons why I'm wondering, it seems like those of us that live in the city pay so much higher property taxes, and so when it comes time to sell a home in the city, there seems to be pressure for people to just buy on the outskirts and then use the city services.
Yep, it's about half. It's about 50-50 right now, and you're dead on with that. That's an inequity issue that also is part of the revenue sharing. Of fully funded does get at some of that as well, but when it's not, it doesn't work as well as it was supposed to. And you see more of that imbalance now. And in some cases, depending on where you are, it's a huge imbalance. In some cases, it's not so much, because there is a cost to, again, providing those services, and folks do come in and partake. So that's an issue. I thought I saw another hand somewhere. All right. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to come out and talk to you guys tonight. This is a really important issue. This is not something that's going to, I know everyone's kind of got their eye on the election. This is not an election issue. This is something that is going to continue until we get real reform in our system. This is something that's going to continue to burden our communities, and it will have a real impact on folks at the local level. So again, I encourage you to think about it. If you're so inclined, go back to that site and learn more about this. And if you have the opportunity to talk to your legislator about it, talk to them about it in a way it means something to you. You don't have to tell them what I said. They've heard all the malarkey I got to say. Talk to them about it in a way that matters to you, because that really has a bigger impact than you might think. So I thank you all very much. All right?
Can I ask you one thing?
Yeah.
I spoke with Senator Ford, speaking, and he was leaving a meeting, and he asked what I did, and I told him, he said, well, you guys really need to get on this medical marijuana. There's some kind of income that's coming through the state level. Do you know anything about this? That's
You sure you mean get on it? Like,
well, I really don't know if he got that or not. But, there's all this revenue that's coming in from people having cards and people doing, I don't know how it's being created, if it's coming from these dispensaries or whatever. But there's all this money in Lansing, and he said, people in northern Michigan need to start getting on, we get some.
yeah, unfortunately, I don't know that much about it. I know that there's a bill right now that changes whether or not they can come into your town or not, but I don't even know enough to be dangerous about that. It's just not my area right now. Did you have another question?
Yeah, do either of the political parties have this as part of their platform to address the revenue sharing?
Great question. So the governor has told us since he got first elected that I'm not going to say revenue sharing per se, but dealing with municipal finance was a priority of his. As recently as a month ago, we had a meeting in our office, and in that meeting we had the state treasurer, Nick Curry. We had John Walsh, who was the governor's local government policy director, and Lieutenant Governor's chief of staff, Nat, whose last name I can't remember at the moment. But in any event, to have those three guys in the room at the same time is almost an act of God in and of itself. And each of those individuals expressed that they get it. This is an issue. We need to be working actively on solutions. And Walsh said he had spoken with the governor as recently as that morning, who reiterated his support for government finance reform. So that's positive. We've also had meetings with House and Senate policy staff. So these would be the staffers, not the legislators per se, but they're the ones that really, behind the scenes drive a lot of the stuff. And they were all supportive conceptually. We had really incredibly positive. We even walked out there shaking our heads going, wow, that was way more positive than we might think. Now, having said all that, Lansing time is like a time machine. I mean, it moves at a different pace than the rest of the world. And sometimes that means it moves like a snail, and sometimes that means I wake up tomorrow morning and I got to drive 100 miles an hour back to Lansing because something is blowing up. But the fact that we have that many people that are commenting, and I won't name specific legislators, but there are a number of folks that have expressed things like, the pendulum seems to have swung too far the other way. It's time to start talking about looking at some of this stuff, or talking about the revenue sharing in ways they haven't talked about it before. So we feel like these efforts are paying off. The fact that we're having the conversations at all is positive. Getting this on people's radar is a big part of that. Excuse me. So we're very encouraged right now, actually. But again, this will still be a long thing. We won't be back here at Christmas saying, hey, I just want to come back and tell you we got everything squared away. I mean, this will probably be months and years of effort. It's not going to, there's a finite amount of dollars. There's not an appetite for big tax increases. We wouldn't even advocate for big tax increases. We're advocating for, can we be smarter with the dollars we have? Can we provide more tools? Can we provide more local options? Can we do things smarter? We think there's a lot can be done along those ways, and I think we're going to have support for doing some of that stuff. Did I see a hand somewhere? In the back.
You obviously advocated this. Do you see any advantage to collaborate with Matt to help spread the word, if you will?
Yeah, we work with MAC and MTA all the time. Yeah, they're just because they're not standing next to me doesn't mean that we do that. We talk with them on a variety of issues. We probably, those three organizations agree 85% of the time. There's those odd issues where we're on the opposite side, but great working relationship with all those groups. Yeah.
I'm really encouraged when I hear you saying that the league is going to increase drafting legislation, which I'd sure like to see if push that much more. It makes you wonder who actually is doing this. The legislator is doing that. When you talk to them personally, they're showing up and voting, but is it some law firm that's actually? Some of these things are written just plain.
Yeah, actually, there's a whole division. I don't know what the exact term is. That Legislative Services Bureau is what it's called. And when they have an idea, they sit down with them and they talk through their idea, and then those guys go write that stuff up, and then they come back and they work it through, and then it'll come out as the draft legislation, and as people start being on it.
For you, the league, to move into that arena?
We work with those guys all the time. Yeah, we work with them all the time. And so when you come in, sort of the backdoor way it would work, if you had a legislator who was interested in an idea, and we said, we've got a draft of an idea, and you hand it off, and they'll twist on it a little bit, and then you start working from that. But yeah, we work with those guys all the time. In the back as well, yeah.
You mentioned two lawsuits regarding funded mandates and hold harmless local units of government or tax changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if did you mention how those turned out?
Well, it just got filed, actually.
Oh,
So
sorry.
we're not a party to it. I want to be clear about that. We are not a party to that lawsuit. There was a separate group put together. There was a law professor, John Moji, out of Wayne State Law, and a city manager from East Point, Steve Duchesne, who were the first two guys that started talking about this. Steve happened to be a law student with them, and they were talking a lot about this and about the dire straits of some of their communities. Steve's community happens to be one of the most impacted about this, and so they started a research project probably 2 years ago, looking into what this meant and was it real, and is this just a couple of crazy guys talking at the bar, or is there something here? And the more they got into it, they said, there's actually some compelling legal arguments that could be made here. And so that got filed formally within the last month. It's very recent that it got filed. Now, again, this will be a long slog if it gets anywhere. But the arguments are interesting. To suggest that a privately run school shouldn't count towards local government funding doesn't seem like that crazy of an idea to me. To suggest that when the voters changed how the funding worked, that this fraction should have been changed. Again, I think those are compelling arguments. Now, how the court will see it, I don't know. No one should be waiting to get a check for, $300 million or something like that, but it's interesting, yeah.
Are there local units of government that are thinking about going together and maybe having a suit?
They have. They've actually created, I forgot what they call their group, but it's probably about 20 communities I think they're asking folks to contribute, I forget the number, it's not a big number, $2,000 or something towards the supporting the cause. The Sugar Law Center, which is I forget, not a rights, I can't think of what law firm that does stuff pro bono basically, is helping with a lot of the legal work on this. So, but they are looking for communities to come in and help support that. So if there's an interest, Steve from East Point would be the guy to reach out to. But again, we're not a part of it, but we certainly are aware of it. And we just think it speaks to, again, sort of the dire straits that folks find themselves in, that we have to resort to those type measures to deal with this stuff.
Well, it's a lot of money involved,
It's a tremendous amount of money involved.
and if the state made some sort of resolution, law, or whatever, that said they would do that, it seems like there could be a case.
Yeah, like I said, it's interesting. I mean, I've been municipal finance guy by trade before I joined the league, and so I've been in and around this for a very long time. And when I first heard they were going to do it, I kind of sloughed it off like, my crazy uncle over there is going to. And when they finally put it together and I got the brief and I read it, I was like, that's interesting. They make some compelling arguments. So in a perfect world, that's probably a 5 to 10 year legal battle that So, but interesting nonetheless. It'd be interesting to see. Any other questions? Well, again, I thank you very much. I can't say how much I appreciate it. Thank you.